we definitely roll in the same space. So we're, like kind of ships passing, ships passing in the night with so much um overlap and connection, you know.
Oh yeah. I mean, we go back. I'm trying to think. I was thinking like, how far do the two of us go back together? And it's at least like 2000. I want to say at least during the 150th, right? If not
Yeah,
before.
it was 11, 10 or 11, I
Yeah,
think.
2010, 11.
And
Yeah,
I connected with you through Ta-Nehisi Coates's that wonderful Atlantic, was it a blog?
it was a blog. Yeah,
Yeah. And so this would it was Civil War 150th. You
yeah,
were very engaged. I have a feeling I was aware of your work in Virginia
yeah.
when I was, working at, for everybody's benefit here, Kevin and I go super far back. We are both historians. We are both very non-traditional historians, I would say, because Kevin has spent a lot of time in the classroom. I have spent a lot of time working with museums and
Yeah.
historical societies and public memory. And so we came across each other. You were a regular commenter on Coates's blog. You were also he called you like a real good faith.
Yeah.
That was the thing about that blog. And that's the thing we've lost, I think,
Yeah.
in the morass is that, and I struggle with this, Kevin, but there was no good faith. When I realized social media, there was no good faith discussion, particularly in Facebook. With
Right.
Facebook became all the people in your life
Yeah.
you ever came across, your kindergarten teacher through the kid who used to bully you in middle school, all of them, and then everybody in between,
Yep.
your aunts and your uncles, people you would only talk to once a year otherwise, and they're
Yeah.
all in your business,
Yeah.
and they're all nobody wants to talk to you about real issues. They just want to spout their talking points.
You're
So
right.
with Coates and with you on Civil War memory, and the fact of the matter is, y'all, Kevin is on his third platform now on social media online and is killing it. Thousands of people follow him, and you learned how to do this. Like so yeah, let's talk. I
I
want
mean,
to
look,
give you
just
that
to
opening.
sort of just to follow up on what you were just saying about Ta-Nehisi. I mean, you remember this. I mean, I started blogging in 2005. And I mean, it was a pretty robust blogosphere. There were a lot of Civil War bloggers. Some of them sort of came and went. They put their 3 months in. They realized they didn't have anything more to say, and that was it. But a good number of them continued. But look, we were all, I would say a lot of us were, well, we were all white, for the most part, white men, and, we had really interesting, engaging, sometimes divisive conversations back and forth. Ta-Nehisi comes along and he really sort of was instrumental in mixing things up because he came at this whole question about the history of the war and especially the memory and legacy of the Civil War from a completely different perspective. And I think a lot of people just, didn't know what to do with him. But it goes to your point that these platforms have the potential to really enrich public understanding of these complicated subjects. And that's certainly something that I've tried to do over the years. But, as you well know, I mean, it takes a community, right? Because there's so much interaction between us.
That I mean, the point there was so good. Was it was quality conversation moderated.
Yeah.
I don't even know how he had time because the guy was writing books, and then he became MacArthur's genius, and all of this. But I learned, I'm going to say like the nuances that you were talking about. So, we'll get quickly into memory because I think this is an important thing for my work at Conversation from the Crossroads, right? Like I use the Allman Brothers as the lens through which to look at all of this.
I got
So,
my book right here.
uh,
Just if you don't have this book, folks, if you're a rock fan, Allman Brothers fan, you
Southern
need this.
music
You
fan.
need this book.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for
Of
that because usually
course.
I'm the one bringing it up. Kevin
Play all
also has
night.
a blurber for the book, and his blurb is on Amazon. It's a tremendous. I use it a lot, but as I looked at them, I have a PhD in history. I only have that because I was like, yeah, I want one. It wasn't like I went to school for 12 years out of college. I wanted to write that book.
Yeah.
As I did the work, and I've been doing Southern history my entire life, you realize all these parallels, like, and it's to Civil War memory. It is to Southern memory. It is to civil rights. It is a very Southern Gothic story, which is something I've started really digging into because I've never seen the parallels made. But the idea was there's a long tail of history that feeds into this. And I use music as the lens through which you can view it. But
Yep.
we could talk just Civil War memory. 5 miles up the road here, the lonely Confederate statue that's in Franklin Town Square, to the Lee Monument there in Richmond, to battlefields and Civil War reenactments and all this. So, like memory, this was one I was like, I want to unpack this a bit with Kevin. I always say nostalgia is a hell of a drug. Like nostalgia is addictive. It makes you think things that weren't true. Like the past was somehow better.
Yeah.
And then you add to it this layer of public memory, which is honestly how we grapple with the past. I mean, and public memory isn't, but memory is how we grapple with the past. Everything from remembering your grandmother's cooking
Yep.
and the smell of the kitchen,
That's right.
or the smell of the garage where you worked with your pops if you did that, or the cigarette smoke in the bar where like all of
Yeah.
those things, to statues, to books, to everything else. And you've really helped unpack that with students first, right? Like your work begins with youth who are not fooled
Right.
by any of the bullshit that gets served. They are not fooled.
Yep.
Uh,
It's a reminder. It's a reminder. A couple of things come to mind listening to you. It's a reminder that memory, especially public memory, and especially public memory of the Civil War or any historic period that stands out, is very much generational, right? There are a lot of generational shifts in how people remember the past. And that emotional connection, for one generation can be very different based on what's happening around you at a certain time. So, I mean, if you take kids who are coming of age, who have come of age over the last, say, 10, 15 years, they're filtering their understanding of the Civil War era and Reconstruction, perhaps, through Black Lives Matter, through the very divisive public debate that's been taking place, over the last 10, 15 years. That's very different from perhaps a grandparent, right? Who remembers maybe watching the movie Gone with the Wind or some other kind of lost cause cultural event that shaped their early years, right? And then you can go back even further. So, I mean, it's a reminder. I think I agree with you that it's a reminder of just how important a kind of emotional connection can be in how we think about ourselves in relationship to the past because we're personally invested, right? I mean, one of the things, for example, I did a lot of writing, working with students and public groups around the country since 2010 over the monument issue, the Confederate monument issue specifically. And one thing that really stands out is, sure, people can disagree over whether these statues and monuments should stay or be removed, but when you actually dig down into a lot of these differences, a lot of it comes down to just your own emotional or lack of emotional attachment, or a very different emotional attachment to a specific monument. Whether or not, you've walked by a statue since you were a little kid and maybe you played, inside of a monument, if it was at a park or some other kind of public space. Perhaps you walked by a monument and all you felt was that you are somehow not a full member of a community, right? That somehow that monument sent a very different message of exclusion, perhaps if you're African American, for example. And a lot of people just never gave it any thought, right? So there's all of this that you have to maneuver through and negotiate. And that can create it creates an interesting dynamic. It creates potentially very interesting dialogue. And there's no other, one of the things I find so fascinating about the Civil War and its legacy is that there's really no other event in American history that comes close to the emotional investment. I mean, Robert Penn Warren sort of summed this up in the 1960s, right? This kind of felt connection in the to the past that he explores so eloquently, and I think there's some truth to that, right? And I assume you agree with that.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
yes. Yes. I'm a living, breathing example of all of the what
I
you're
know.
talking about.
Yeah, you have that connection. I don't. I grew up in South Jersey, New Jersey, surfing and skateboarding growing up. I didn't think at all of I couldn't tell you the first thing about a history class in high school or even the first, say, 2 years of college. I had no interest at all in American history. I mean, forget about the Civil War. I didn't come to that until my mid-20s by accident. So, I mean, I have that's what I maybe it's an advantage I have that I was never invested in it emotionally. I came at it
Mm,
from a purely academic kind of curiosity, if you will,
yeah.
you know?
And you were a transplant in down into Virginia, right? So you're a little bit of a carpet we have
Yeah.
this term. This is the
Oh,
third time
totally.
I've used this in this podcast.
Totally.
The carpetbagger syndrome. I've
Yep.
seen you. I've seen what people the names they called you. Obviously anti-Semitic, but
The whole thing.
there's there's no great and you had actual death
Oh,
threats
yeah. Oh, yeah.
in it with
A school that I taught at in Virginia had to shut down one day because of a threat. I mean, I've been
talk
through
about
it all.
emotional investment. To me, there are few things I am that emotional about, my family being one, and I imagine the Allman Brothers are another, but like 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 not somebody's historical argument. What I end
Yeah.
up doing if I disagree with somebody or they're being vapid,
Yeah.
there's a button called the block button.
That's right.
And I don't take it anymore. I know a lot of people who will, but, you talk about the lost cause, and, I mean, your people on Civil War memory don't need to think about this, but maybe some of mine do more so, right? The war ends, it's a disgrace,
Yeah.
the South is just devastated. They've lost their entire labor force overnight, and any possible reparations for that are out the window because they have just waged a 5-year war that killed, hundreds of thousands of people. So you're basically starting over. And all of a sudden, right out of it, and I am a product of this.
Yeah.
My grandmother, born in the early 20th century, her parents were Civil War era people on both sides, right? And the Reconstruction stories that I grew up with, I mean, it was all a way of reframing the war
Yeah.
as this noble cause
Right.
against a
An
Central Powers.
industrialized aggressor,
Yeah.
right?
When I would teach at college, I was always teaching the survey classes, and, that's where they put the adjuncts, and, I remember a student going, "No, the war was about states' rights," and I just
Yeah.
looked and I said, "States' right to do what?"
For what? Yeah. What was the state right?
And then you flipped it. Jim Lowen did the same thing. I know you're aware of Jim Lowen, but you flipped
Sure.
it just recently where you said they actually really weren't fighting for states' rights because they were against the fugitive slave I'm
Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
that they were for pro
For
fugitive slave
Oh,
act,
yeah, that's right.
grabbing enslaved freedom
It's
seekers and
yeah.
pulling them back south against the state's laws
Right.
outside of the South.
It's Northerners. I mean, I'm in Boston. I mean, it's states like Massachusetts that are passing, what they would have called personal liberty laws that, insist that a state has the right to resist federal encroachment, right? The federal government actually reaching in and removing fugitive slaves back to the slaveholding states. And so, yeah, it's a reminder that, sure, there are political principles, constitutional principles that, we embrace. But at the level of politics, quite often, what you find, and this includes the mid 19th century, is there's a lot of I guess what you might call pragmatism involved. So the question is, what political principles will help you achieve your goal? And not just in the 1850s, but you can look at other decades throughout different parts of the antebellum period. the slaveholding class, the class that holds, political power, they have no problem at all, sort of wielding the power of the federal government to protect slavery. And as you get closer to, to what becomes the Civil War in 1860-61, they become even more adamant in, in claiming that federal power, because they see, many of them begin to see the writing on the wall, right? And they're worried that, they see that slavery, the institution of slavery, is in a very precarious position, right? And so it's going to be the federal government that ultimately protects it. And once the Confederacy was formed, here's another part that people tend to ignore. Once the Confederate government takes hold, the states in the Confederacy are the ones who have to bear the brunt of federal power, because the Confederacy and a lot of people who are, in the government, from various places and at different times, they are also adamant in claiming as much federal power to protect the institution of slavery while at war. And the Confederate government, as you know, never shied away from passing laws that would, aid in the war effort, whether that is conscription itself, the first draft in American history, but the conscription, impressment of various resources from food crops to enslaved labor itself. Robert E. Lee was insistent. He said, late in the war, he said, whatever the Confederate government needs to fight this war, it shall have. And so, even Lee was an extreme Confederate nationalist. And that speaks to what they understood as the importance of federal power in fighting the war and hopefully winning it.
and preserving slavery.
That's exactly it. And
Let's
look, and as always remind my readers and other audiences, Confederates were never shy about announcing that. They were proud of it. The institution of slavery it wasn't when Alexander Stephens talks about, the vice president talks about slavery as the cornerstone. This is Confederate nationalism. This is something that they are actually proud of, right? Southerners are not apologizing. They haven't been apologizing for slavery since John Calhoun in the early 1830s, right? So,
Yeah.
um, listen to real Confederates. They will steer you in the right direction.
And I that's an excellent point, because let's segue then to the monuments discussion, which I think is really important. And
Yeah,
we spent I went to graduate school the first time in the late '90s, master's degree. We discussed this some, but
yeah,
man, by the time I did graduate school the second time, it was a hot issue. We were in the middle of the 150th. I remember discussions with you and several others saying, I and I do believe this. I think the primacy of the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, the lost cause narrative being it was not about slavery. This was noble people fighting to defend their homeland only. There was
yeah.
nothing else involved. So Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson were heroes. Well, we'll do Lee, Jackson, and because we're going to talk about Stone Mountain, you and me too.
Okay.
But if people, we, we've had this discussion, and people argue against monument removal, moving. Oh, you're erasing history, and
Yeah,
both of us have come to agree, right? Even when they take down things we like,
right,
it's not erasing history. You
right.
never erase history.
Yeah,
A monument, a memorial, a historic site is a historical argument set in stone.
and in time. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So we have to then look. It's not just about the monument celebrating the Confederate cause, ostensibly, but or whichever, or Robert E. Lee, or any of these things. We hone on the Confederacy because I think a lot of people are concerned. Like, hey, this is not what we want to celebrate as a people anymore. The people who argue you're removing history or whatnot seem to me to often miss the primary sources, the statements of the people who
That's right.
were putting those monuments up.
Yeah,
And we don't have a place for those
yeah,
except in this public sphere.
right.
But it was an intentional maneuver coming out of all of this to publicly reframe for Southerners, mainly,
Yeah,
their civic culture, their civic
that's right.
history regarding this tragic event.
Yeah, I always think it's helpful, for people to understand. There is an evolution in during the post-war period in terms of the purpose and even the placement of Confederate monuments. And when you look at the first few years, I'm talking roughly 1865, well, roughly to the end of
Reconstruction.
official Reconstruction, 1877. Let's just round it off to 1880. Most of those early Confederate monuments are placed in cemeteries.
Yep.
And, they are an attempt to deal with what you just, I think rightfully pointed out, just the utter devastation, right? The scale of death, right? That white Southerners experienced. I mean, we're not trying to sort of vindicate their cause in kind of applying some empathy here, but just to sort of understand and appreciate just the scale of the shift in their world, right? They thought that their cause had been ordained by God, and lo and behold, these regiments go off to war together, raised in local towns and counties. And by 1865, you can have places with very few men of military age walking around. The ones who are walking around perhaps are without limbs. So the scale of death is everywhere. And so there's a natural push to commemorate that, right? To somehow memorialize it. That makes perfect sense to me. And so Hollywood Cemetery, the cemetery in Winchester, Virginia, ladies' memorial associations take the lead in doing this. Once white Southerners regain control, however, of local and state governments, roughly by 1880, you begin to see a dramatic shift in where these monuments are placed. They end up being placed in front of courthouses where people vote at the time. They end up being placed on prominent avenues and boulevards, parks. And the focus of the monuments and statues also takes a very different sort of shape. And so they're no longer sort of attempting simply to memorialize the dead, although they're still doing that work. They're much more explicit about the cause. And some of them are very explicit about the Anglo-Saxon race, right? Preserving its heritage. And especially by the early 20th century, you can really begin to see, especially in some of the dedication addresses, begin to see very clear connections between trying to sort of establish a Jim Crow culture of white supremacy with the cause for which their parents and grandparents fought for in the 1860s. Remember, by the first decade of the 20th century, we're talking about a new generation of white Southerners who never experienced the war or perhaps even Reconstruction.
Hmm.
So there's an attempt through these statues and monuments, this monument landscape that's getting created, to do that kind of public education work, right? And they do it really well. And it's supplemented by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, shaping the kinds of textbooks that are being used in high school and even lower school classrooms. And it speaks to just the success that they will have by perpetuating that lost cause from generation to generation. They were really quite good at what they were doing and what they set out to do, and they understood the challenge because African Americans never acquiesced. They never sort of gave in to this kind of lost cause, whitewashing of history. They maintained, and a wonderful new book just came out by Hillary Green called "Unforgettable Sacrifice," the first book-length study of how African Americans remembered and commemorated the war, and she demonstrates very clearly that African Americans throughout the Jim Crow era are embracing an emancipationist narrative to further their political goals, right? They are steadfast in resisting white supremacy and its sort of historical justification, namely the lost cause, and in pushing for Black empowerment. And it's really, we've really needed this book for a while. But it really, I think, helps us understand just what was at stake at the turn of the 20th century for both African Americans and white Southerners.
And, out of this emerges an entire, sort of landscape that starts right in the 20s to the 50s, 60s, and then we get
Oh,
the
yeah.
big boom with the centennial.
Yep.
Jim Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Lies Across America, rest in peace.
Yeah.
He spoke at a conference I did years ago, was tremendous.
Oh, yeah. I knew him well.
Stood,
Yeah.
stood
Oh,
in a
yeah.
room full of state historical administrators and called out his faulty historical markers. And of course, the issue with markers,
Yeah.
less memorials and markers, right?
Yeah.
Is there's no quality control. Once they go up, they never come down.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I have determined, are probably one of the most effective tools in the toolbox
Mhm.
of, what we would call public historians. And, again, for my audience, yours, the benefit, that term means very little to the world, but to the
Yeah.
historians, man, holy shit, it's a big
Yeah.
deal. But the idea is that how, two ways. One is the history we produce is for the public. It is not necessarily for other academics, although we can do that. And the second is, how does the public engage with the past?
Mhm.
And I'm really glad to hear this about Hillary Green's book. I have not spent a lot of time in that little world since the sesquicentennial.
Yeah.
Um, I'm still convinced, and this was one of the solutions I posted. This was probably about 8 years ago now. The solution is either change the monument like they did with Lee and Richmond, which of course they took down.
Yeah.
What they've done, they did a lot of that in Eastern Europe. I'd been tracking that from post, the fall of the
Oh, you
USSR. So
mean the way the community, sort of embraced it,
takes it over.
takes yeah, appropriates it for its own purpose. Yeah, yeah.
I
Yeah.
like street art, which may look
Yeah.
really ugly to the eye, is a
Yeah.
statement.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, no question.
and then or we're moving to, I think, cemeteries or something maybe less prominent. Totally fine. I have like zero issue with
Yeah.
that. The third is to create more monuments for
Yeah.
other things, create more markers for women, for people of color, for communities, because I don't that's the only way we're ever going to balance the landscape out
Yeah.
to make it right.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about the long tail of lost cause, because this is one of my arguments. So the Allman Brothers Band, we're going to fast forward 100 years to when all this is starting, 1969. They are an integrated band from the very start.
I knew you were gonna somehow bring this back to Allman Brothers Band. I knew. I was like, some point,
Got to get them up
we're
here.
gonna make the
Yep.
move. Go
Yep.
for it, Bob.
And these are Southern. All six of them, five of them are from the South. Barry
Yeah.
Oakley, the sixth, is from Chicago, but he's a Southerner. He just was born in the wrong spot. All very egalitarian. They do have a black man, J-Mo, in the band from the get-go. I argue in the book that was significant. I don't argue that they said, "Oh, let's get a black guy and make a
Yeah.
political statement."
Yeah.
But I will say it was a social, political, cultural statement that they did. The piece, though, to talk about it for me, though, is the flag, right?
Yeah.
So we can talk a shit ton about the flag, and we don't necessarily need to. We both read John Koski's book.
Yeah. That's the book to read.
Fantastic book.
Yeah.
John and I had a dialogue. I think maybe I had you in it because you might have given me his name. But anyway, about the flag, and he didn't really touch its use in Southern rock.
Right.
The Allman Brothers weren't using the flag at all. Nobody really was until about 72, 73,
Skinner?
74. Well, so this is what I'm trying to piece together.
Yeah.
Skinner, yes, but the Allman Brothers had used it in 74 as on marketing. In fact, that poster, you can't really see it. It's off the thing.
Yeah.
Well, shit, I'll take it down, actually. Like, you'll pause for the cause here. You guys
Yeah.
will recognize that fella right there, right?
Yeah.
Like, this was their,
Yeah.
so this was their 1974 poster for their tour. Summer campaign 74, basically with Robert E. Lee coming through the flag.
Yeah.
You see it good? Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
And then, and so the irony here, right, is that 1/3 of the band at this point is black. Bass player Lamar Williams and J-Mo are the two black men. There are images of them on stage with both the flag and this from this era.
Yeah.
So the piece the piece I say, I argue this in the book, and I will argue more here. I've argued all over Long Live the ABB, several spots. People often, fans, would say, well, the Allman Brothers never used the flag, so therefore blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Not only did they do it, It was official in their merch and in their promotions. And what does this say to me, right? Chuck Leavell, their piano player at the time, keyboard player, now plays with the Stones. He's embarrassed by it. He admits, like, we weren't even thinking about it. That's true. That's true. But I will argue that anybody thought it was right in their offices, Phil Walden, their manager, or some say Alan Paul argues that it might have been some marketing folks like in New York who said, hey, let's use this. And Skinner picks it up as their backdrop. But for the Allman Brothers, Third Black, you're going out there with that. What does that tell me? It tells me the success of the lost cause narrative, that
Yeah.
these are raised in Southern schools, taught that this was rebellion, more or less good-natured rebellion, because now we're translating it to rock. The Allman Brothers were, without a doubt,
Yeah.
rebels
Yep.
from the South, unabashedly from the South.
Yeah. When does the Dukes of Hazzard start? Later.
Okay, so there was the next one. This is later 70s, early 80s. I don't know
Really,
exactly when it started.
yeah, it's around there, I guess.
There was a resurgence coming out of it that included that, you know,
The Centennial has something to do with this. The sort of
heck yeah.
commercialization aspect of the Centennial. So, organizers, especially at the state level, but more generally, organizers of centennial events tended to steer clear of the racial aspects of the war. They wanted to sort of focus on, the fighting between men on both sides who are fighting for their respective causes. But we're not going to talk about what those causes were. You've got, of course, iconic figures like Lee, Jackson, and others, right? So I assume that the Centennial has something to do with that, the sort of commercialization. I mean, earlier, and John Koski does talk about this, the first real kind of attempt to sort of commercialize it or to sort of utilize the image of the Confederate flag beyond veterans' activities, our North-South football games in the 1930s and 40s. And so that begins. Now, that's happening at the same time as, the Dixiecrats bolting from the Democratic Party in 48 and utilizing the Confederate flag at their convention. And then, of course, as we both know, and Koski covers this in depth, the utilizing of the Confederate flag as a form of massive resistance
Yeah.
against civil rights. And look, I don't care what you say, and regardless of how popular the flag has become because of the centennial, no one is really. You can't tell me that Americans, white Americans especially, don't come out of the 1960s with some understanding of how that flag is perceived by African Americans. I mean, it was there, for anyone to see during the height of the civil rights movement. Right. I mean, the newspapers and television are covering, protests and counter protest, and that flag was always present. So, I'm kind of curious to see um, that dynamic that you're describing within the band and within the broader community. It would be interesting to know a bit more about how they're responding to these two things, or that whole scene regarding the flag,
Yeah,
the whole culture.
I hadn't actually gotten into the Centennial in my mind at all, but it was mostly for me, like, number one, they're pretty wasted. They just get on stage, do their thing. They're not really paying attention to their gear or
Yeah.
whatever. But, like, it still doesn't excuse it. And I think you just said it really best. Like, there is a across the board, there's a little bit of that nostalgia argument, memory, etc., about what symbols mean to people, right?
Yeah.
And the flag, the Confederate flag, the St. Andrew's cross, the rebel. I call it the rebel flag because I want to note it was never an official flag, nothing like that, but it became a symbol of massive resistance to the civil rights movement. Which, for anybody on this call, Google massive resistance, and you can see what that meant. But it was
Oh, yeah.
a just like it was the rallying cry at Gettysburg, it was rallying cry at in Montgomery on the Selma to Montgomery march.
Yeah.
You can see it at University of Mississippi. You can see it the Stanton Schoolhouse store. Like, it is just
Yeah.
ubiquitous in this era.
Yeah.
And to say 10 years later, oh, we're going to wave the flag because we're rebel Southerners, and anybody today look back and say,
Yeah.
and that's I read that is one of the pieces. My dissertation advisor, Van West, actually had to help me write it because he's like, you just need to say it, Bob. There
Yeah.
were people back then who objected to this at that point,
Yeah.
and there have been people who continued to. And in my
Mm,
opinion, and the issue's closed.
yeah.
It was
So, I mean, look,
wrong.
the band may have been shielded to a certain extent. I mean, if you have people around
Very
you
much so.
who are, not going to raise an issue about it. And, we're talking about what matters most, right? The music,
Yep.
right? The show, right? Um, and having a good time. And so, if your audience, and I don't know, I mean, this is more a question. I assume the audience was overwhelmingly white.
Yeah. Like most rock
Yeah,
music,
that's right.
pretty and, in this era, um no, yes. I think you're hitting on it. When you see, uh, because well, you can the Skinner opened for the Stones at Nebworth. The Allman Brothers had done it, I think, the year before. That's when the big banner, you can see the
Uh,
flag in the crowd
yeah,
from England
yeah,
because, it does have this association, a positive association through about the 80s, early 90s when people really in the rock realm started looking at it. I think
yeah,
overall, like we said, it
yeah,
was an issue. But, the Allman Brothers are Southerners. They're
yeah,
unabashedly Southern.
yeah,
They lived in the South, stayed in the South, made music in the South. That's one of the things that separates them from the pack in this era. And they traveled around with a black dude. And
yeah,
that's and they had long hair and they were wasted and had lots of women hanging around them.
yeah.
Um, that was in and of itself, given the culture that they had, absolutely groundbreaking. Absolutely groundbreaking.
I
Coming
think
right out of the civil rights movement.
I think one of the things you're saying that that's important to point out here, and one of the things that I'm hearing is that I think where we are right now in 2026, I think it's got to be difficult for some people to appreciate the what things were like even before 2015. And what do I mean by this? I mean, you mentioned a couple minutes ago that, by the 1990s, certainly the monuments and the flag, the public display of the flag had become, more controversial, right? Certainly than in decades past. But I still can recall just the utter shock first of that flag coming down from the State House grounds in Columbia, South Carolina,
Mhm.
right? Following the horrific murders in Charleston in 2015 by Dylan Roof. But even more to the point, just the scale or the extent to which the monument landscape has been transformed over the last 10, 12 years. I wrote a piece, for Smithsonian Magazine in like 2017. So some of the monuments and statues had already started coming down. And I wrote a piece basically making the argument that this will not happen in Richmond, Virginia, because the city has done such a good job of adding to the monument landscape. It has filled it out. It's telling a much richer story. And so now we have these monuments in conversation. We love to use that language, right? Public historians, we love that language. Monuments and statues in conversation. And I thought because of the work Richmond had done, that first it would be a lesson for other towns and cities across the country that are dealing with this issue. And then what happens in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd? I mean, within like a couple months, well, 2 years roughly, I should say, they're all gone. They're all gone, Bob. And I still have trouble wrapping my head around that transformation. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is it is, when you go back to the 1970s, there's a kind of, at least in white America, there's a kind of normalcy, right, when it comes to these Confederate symbols.
Sure.
Politicians on both sides of the aisle, more so Republican. There's a wonderful new book by Timothy Galsworthy that just came out about this, The Republican House Divided, where he sort of explores how Republicans are beginning to grow even more attached to Confederate symbolism, coming out of the Southern strategy of Nixon in the early 1970s. But even the Democrats, especially Southern Democrats, are still
Yeah.
kind of, they're playing it cool when it comes to the lost cause. And now that's going to also shift over time to where we are today. But it is a reminder of how, dare I say, mainstream all of this was unchallenged. All of this was going back to the 1970s. Not entirely. I'm not trying to make that argument, but compared to where we are today, that's why I think understanding change over time, that's why we study history, right? Because we're trying to understand change over time. And it's one of the things I find so fascinating about this specific history, this history of Civil War memory that we're sort of reflecting on right now.
I'm 100% with you, and I was literally just about to say change over time. You took the words right out of my mouth, which means we are truly jamming right now because we're on the tip, and I'm with you. Like I think that is what makes the issue so important is that it remains. And as a historian, an historian of place, an historian of public memory, I love it. Like
Yeah.
I love the fact that the debate is there. I love the fact that, I can talk to people about it and there are opinions and ideas and I can share mine, where we can. Um, and I agree with you, right? Like you wrote your piece in the Smithsonian. We can't predict the future. We can only look at the past and interpret what it is because I
It's still up, man. You can read it, and it's just like so
don't
embarrassing.
necessarily don't necessarily disagree with you. And same time period when I remember the same thing with South Carolina, and the other one I remember, which we've discussed, but was
Yeah,
Montgomery.
yeah,
And what happened in Montgomery that same weekend, the governor, whoever it was, and
yeah.
not somebody I was a fan of, decided they found the loophole in the law that allowed them to take down their flags without the legislature's approval.
Right.
And over the weekend, took it down, took the flagpoles down, sealed the ground where the things were. And then, of course, now
Yeah,
Alabama has laws against that. But
yeah.
I'm exactly the same way. Like when I saw Southern state houses maneuver as a result of Dylan Roof's terrorist attack on Mother Emanuel Church, that was a real positive to
Yeah.
me.
And
One of the
Montgomery. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
w- yeah, go ahead with Montgomery, and then I got
No, no.
my
I was just going to say, and I think Montgomery is a great example of a city that is trying to is trying to explore other sort of roads of sort of public memory, especially of the Civil War and civil rights. I mean, I've led numerous tours, student tours that go through Montgomery, and each time I am just more and more impressed with the changes to the public landscape. So, I mean, a lot of that, of course, has to do with the efforts of one man, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative. But you can walk the Capitol grounds now, and yeah, there is a huge Confederate monument on one side that was dedicated in the, I think, early 1890s. And then, of course, there's a statue of Jefferson Davis right on the steps where, close to where he took the oath of office in 1861. And then at the bottom of the stairs, there is a new display of like 25 sort of brass reliefs of various scenes in Alabama's history, and a lot of it covers the issue of slavery and civil rights, and it's a remarkable transformation, and all of this. We are like in the midst of it right now. I mean, we're sort of living through this, and it's incredibly exciting to sort of watch it play out. And I think I don't know if you wanted to talk about this later on, but I mean, it's happening in a very fraught moment, obviously, in our political life, because we've got from the top down a federal government that wants to put a stop, obviously, to all of this. But I'm getting ahead of myself because you wanted to, I
no,
interrupted you.
actually. Actually, no. That is on my list of things to talk about a little bit. And I'll throw out my
Go
one of
for it.
my thoughts here was the first time this administration was in place, they did not realize the power of museums, historic sites. They were not prepared to
Yeah,
try to make them shape their narrative. They were way ready this time. They
yeah.
came gunning for museums, and to everybody here, I've spent a lot of time in the federal funding arena. There's not a lot of federal money that comes away from the federal agencies to museums. It's very couple small agencies, uh, all of them well under $1 billion, all of them like quarter billion or less,
Well,
who are giving money to communities. But for the most part, what they're impacting are the federal agencies, the Smithsonian, the National Park
Park
Service. You've been
Service.
very involved in, the Park Service discussions, and there's no doubt this is censoring history.
Yeah.
There is no doubt. Um, but let's talk a little bit about
Oh,
there's an impact here too, right? That we're feeling, but there's also been a backlash
oh yeah.
and some powerlessness as well while things play out. But I think it's a great segue to talk about kind of the current situation when it comes to this. This is our history.
Yeah.
This is the people's history. This is not this is our history.
Yeah.
It's our past,
That's right. That's right.
our resources.
That's right. And I've always tried to emphasize this point. I mean, I spent last year and still am writing about it, but less to a lesser extent. But I mean, last year I was all over this story because, for me, I got my interest in the Civil War essentially came through the National Park Service. I was 1995 house sitting for my master's thesis advisor in Boonesboro, Maryland, a few miles from the Antietam battlefield, and I never thought a day about the Civil War. And he left a list of things for me to do, and one of them was visit Antietam. And one day I decided, all right, I guess I'll go check this place out. And I was, long story short, I was hooked. So for me, from day one, the Park Service has been central to my understanding of American history, the Civil War specifically, but also the importance of what you're describing, which is, the importance of the role of caretakers of the past and the responsibility that we give the men and women of the Park Service and the Smithsonian, right, to do this important work. But yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking to see all of this taking place because you're absolutely right. It is our history, and I think it's important for people to know, and I have to deal with this all the time in my online writing and interactions, which is to say that I'm not trying to make a political statement. Certainly, politics can never be divorced from questions about appropriation of federal funds. That's the nature of the beast, right? You know this better than anyone. And certainly, we've seen debates in previous administrations, but there is nothing that comes close to what we're seeing from the Trump administration. There's nothing from the Republican or the Democratic parties comes close to the threat to public history that we're witnessing right now. And it should be a nonpartisan issue, right? I mean, if you care about history, if you care about good history, history that doesn't ignore the tough questions, then there's really only one position to take, right? I mean, I'm you know I know I'm not saying anything that's news to you. Obviously, we're both on
Yeah,
the
you're
same
pretty.
page.
Yeah, I
I'm
think we
preaching to the
need to
choir, right? Right.
we need to say it though. I think that in the places in the spaces where we can, I think it's important to say it out loud. Yes,
Yeah.
you were all over the story last year, and I think behind your feeling on this, behind mine as well, is
Yeah.
because we know there's really good people
We know
doing
them. That's right.
doing
These are our
great
friends.
things who care deeply, and we also know. I'll
They
throw
don't
this
make any money, right?
one.
They don't make any money, right? They're
It's
selfless. I mean, it's
that yeah, and
yeah.
with the games that we play with shutdowns, right? These poor people end up, do I have a job? Do I not have a job? Am I going to pay my bills? Am I not going to pay my bills? Here's something I'll throw out to you on this line. I'm not, I mean, I have gained tremendously from examining my lost cause path,
Yeah.
my lost cause past, my understanding of who Robert E. Lee is. I mean, that was my dad was a Kappa Alpha fraternity member. He was a hero to them.
Say no more. Right. Right.
And so I had to, unpack a whole lot of that. But the one that got me probably more than anything, my first graduate class was on the New South. And among many books we read, including C. Van Woodward's
Yeah.
Strange Career of Jim
Yeah.
Crow, we read Dan Carter's A Rage for Order about Wallace,
Oh,
Asa Carter, and all that.
yeah.
And
I'm
it
reading
was
that book right now about Asa Carter. Yeah.
fantastic book. Reading about the modern civil rights movement changed in '97, like you going to Antietam, changed my life, um, in a in an amazing way, and I find salvation in history,
Yeah.
where I always say to my colleagues, "We're not saving lives, we're saving souls."
Yeah.
But
That's right.
let's why are difficult stories important to look at in the past? Why should we not ignore these things?
Yeah. I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, you're asking the right question. I mean, and I think, sometimes you just have to you have to separate out, sort of the obvious political game that's being played right now, right? Obviously the manipulation that we're seeing, it's not random. It's an attempt, I think, quite often to distract us from other things going on that this
Yes,
administration would rather us not focus on. That's certainly the case. But I also think, and I think this is an important component of understanding the public or the politics of history and the politics of memory, and that is to say, and I think this is something that the United Daughters of the Confederacy understood, that that you can control how people view the world around them, themselves in relationship to the world around them, by controlling how they think about the past, shaping, I should say, how they think about the past. And I think this administration, to what extent they've thought this through is hard to know. But there is something that it seems that something about that resonates with me in trying to understand why they are so adamant in issuing, for example, an executive order like they did last year to restore truth and sanity to American history that involves having to ignore subjects that are unpatriotic, the history of slavery, the history of white supremacy. And it seems to me that if you can minimize the extent to which America was divided in the past, if you can minimize white supremacy, if you can, if you can do that, then perhaps you're going to be successful in the present or in the future in arguing and pushing for certain kinds of legislation, right? And so I think we always have to be careful. And I think in this regard, we have to be careful when it comes to both political parties. Now, I'm not trying to equate the two right now because I think we see something very clear coming from, again, that's unprecedented, that's coming from the Trump administration. But so I think that's part of it. I also think, getting back to our earlier discussion, that I think this is less true because it seems to me that statistics are pretty clear that Americans, regardless of your political affiliation, and focusing on a younger generation for the most part, we're pretty comfortable talking about complicated subjects in history,
truth.
right? My last full time job was at a fairly conservative private school in Charlottesville. And, I have to assume that a good percentage of my students were from Republican families. I never had a problem. I used Eric Foner in my classes, his Give Me Liberty textbook. I mean, I never really had any problem at all talking about the class struggle, racism. Once in a while, a parent might, ask a question, but it was never any, excuse me, anything to worry about. Certainly, my students were right there with me. And so I think if you're talking about an older generation that perhaps grew up at a time when they didn't have to think about these kinds of subjects, right? You might feel a bit defensive, right? When you see the world around you changing in ways in which you couldn't predict, right? When you were younger. And I can relate to that. I'm getting to the age, and perhaps both sort of something we sort of overlap on another thing we overlap with. The world does change, and you find yourself more and more struggling to keep up. Things get faster, and sometimes you do feel as if you're being left behind. I certainly feel that, when it comes to certain things about technology,
Sure.
right? But other things out in the culture, I really have to sort of sometimes push myself to say, all right, slow down, look at this again, right? Take your time. Don't just judge it just because it seems unfamiliar, right? Music is a great example. Coming back to that, right? Like I had no idea who Bad Bunny was before I mean, I knew the name, right? Now that Super Bowl halftime show blew my mind. I've watched it 5 or 6 times since. But, I had to sort of watch it again, right? Because a lot of it was unfamiliar to me, both
Yep.
visually and sound wise, right? And so, it takes time. I get it. Like as I get older, I kind of understand that more conservative embrace of the lost cause in the sense of it's familiar to me. I don't want to lose that connection of familiarity, right? You have to sort of constantly push yourself to stay open-minded. It doesn't
Yeah.
come naturally all the time.
I mean, that so my friend Richard, who I will interview for this, calls this Earth School. We go to school, we get degrees, we do this, but we are always in Earth School. We're always learning, or should be. That's the human condition. So you don't learn something in ninth grade or your freshman year in college, an economic lesson, and take that, extrapolate those two to the rest of your life and don't learn another thing, when the things that you learn in our espousing are really thin once you get
Mhm.
below the surface
Yeah,
and start looking at it a little bit. Music's a good one. I was gonna bring this up too, because I mentioned before, I think nostalgia is a hell of a drug. It's like
yeah.
heroin.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
And when you're in the music history world like I am and on social media, Facebook was terrible about this. It was, they don't make music like they used to. Taylor Swift, blah, blah, blah. Well, I happen to love Taylor Swift. I think
yeah,
Tay Tay
yeah,
is, because I got
yeah.
2 daughters. I watched them like raised with her. I've seen her in concert. I play her songs on guitar. I think she's phenomenal. Music wasn't better yesterday.
What our
It was
parents said.
better yesterday
It's
because you were young
it's
and
what our
because it was
parents.
made for you.
It's what our parents said when we were younger.
And so intentionality, like, this is the thing about the Allman Brothers for me, like a
Yeah,
music band that I've just done a deep dive into. And
yeah.
people have these, if you're a music nut, right? You'll have them with the Beatles or with the Rolling Stones. You can pick a band.
David Bowie.
This is a band of 6 guys that formed in 1969. One of them dies in 71, the other one dies in 72. They have these multiple levels of bands. They were active until 2014, so most of the first part of my adult life. But I had to be very intentional about listening to new music throughout that time. I am incredibly intentional that I will not be one of those old heads
Yeah,
who only listens to the music that I listened to when I was
yeah,
20.
yeah,
And it's you're right, radio feeds you that, right? Classic rock had to find a way to bring in Nirvana, which is not classic rock, right? On Green Day and all that. So
yeah,
the radio feeds you the same culture, the television does. Now we have monoculture in a conservative bubble, in a liberal bubble, if you will.
yeah.
And you got a bunch of people, like saying music is so much better when I was younger, or life was better when I was younger. Yeah, because it was simpler.
It's how you consume music. It's so different now, right? I mean,
Oh,
just the sheer joy of going into a music store and just looking for. I used to go into music stores and just sometimes I'd have something I'm there to get, right? So I know what I want, but I would sometimes just look for an album cover that would catch my eye. It's like I'm
yep,
just buying out. I'm out and buying an album cover and just take a chance.
yep.
I think there's also something to say about getting back to. We can go down this hole for a while, but we can actually sort of relate this back to public history and history because how a younger generation today, right? I mean, how many times do you hear from people? Well, kids aren't interested in history, right? Because a Civil War roundtable has closed down, or they're not attending public lectures. Well, that's because kids today are consuming history and information in ways in which we just don't understand, right?
Great
And we're
point.
trying to catch up with. And so, that's another way in which we have to sort of stay on our toes, right?
I absolutely, I think, you know, another thing that I witnessed when I watched this transformation of social media and all of these, nostalgic accounts for home and that sort of stuff, and then you go further, TikTok or Instagram, there's
Yeah,
all kinds of you're 100% right. I've always argued this. People love history. They hate how it was taught to them in middle and high school, and somewhat
right.
college. But college is a little different, but they love history, and most of the time we kinda come around to it normal, not people
Yeah,
unlike us, although you came to it a little later too, but, most of
yeah,
those people come around to it once they, start having kids or you start thinking you lose a parent, you lose a grandparent, you start thinking about longevity and
yeah,
your place, and I mean, I find humanity in the past. I find
yeah,
it's humbling whether I was at the musical instrument museum in Phoenix, earlier this year, and, you're standing in front of homemade instruments from Africa where people are using oil cans to repurpose and make guitars and stuff, or you're standing in front of Dickie Betts's amp, which happened to be there, right?
yeah,
Louis Armstrong's teacher's trumpet. Okay, I saw Louis Armstrong's trumpet, his original trumpet in, New Orleans, and I took a picture. I'm gonna do a post on it because I was like, "Can you imagine everything that derived from Louis Armstrong's first trumpet?" From there is the entirety of American jazz. Not that he's the first jazz musician, but he is Bill Monroe of jazz. He is the guy who put it on the map.
yeah,
And I've now seen his teacher's trumpet and his trumpet.
yeah,
That's humbling.
yeah. There's something
Who
about
am I?
there is
Some
something
speck.
there is something about the study of history. I completely agree. I like the way you frame this, that it's sort of, it sort of points you to a kind of broader humanity that you're a part of. I mean, when I was my, I have a master's degree in history, but I did a master's degree in the '90s in philosophy. And one of my favorite writers was, he lived in the early 19th century. He was more of an essayist. People thought of him more as an essayist at the time than a philosopher. His name was William Hazlitt. And he wrote a short essay called, I think it's called On the Fear of Death and Dying. And he makes this really interesting observation. He writes that, we can sort of trace, there's a point in time before we were born in which we didn't exist. Now that makes perfect sense, right? There's a point in time, before which we didn't exist. There's going to be a point in time in the future where, after which we don't exist. Okay, so we have this very, very brief window. He says it's interesting psychologically that we fear the future moment, because of course that's the fear of death, right, and all these questions. But he says, whatever you can say about that future moment in time that so many of us fear, you can also say the same exact thing about the point in the past before which we didn't exist. But none of us fears not being around before our birth. But we didn't exist in the same way in which we won't exist in this future moment. So that kind of observation, I've it's always stayed with me because it's helped me sort of step back from myself. And especially when I'm reading history, I'm able to sort of, you know, one of the things we're always struggling with is keeping our ego in check, right? That everything revolves around us. And that's a very Western kind of perspective, right? And I get that. But when I'm studying history, and especially when I'm researching history, and I'm really digging into the archives and the sources, and I'm touching some of the documents, I know you've had that experience. I kind of forget myself. And I'm able to sort of take that broader perspective and see myself as just this tiny little speck, if you will, in that broader narrative. I find a kind of peace and comfort in that, in those moments. Um, where where a lot of the kinds of challenges and concerns of life kind of fall away. I mean, history in a way is doing history, I should say, is kind of my zen.
Yeah.
That's my meditation, if you will. I don't know if any of this makes sense, but I just thought
Like,
I'd share that.
well, I mean, again, you're basically looking into a mirror right now in
Yeah.
terms of that because, like, we have these big questions in our heads all the time, right? I think it is a way for me to think about the existential questions a little
Yeah.
bit. Um,
What the
we
hell are
do
we
learn
doing
from the
here?
past. We
Yeah.
also, repeat it. It rhymes, right? It doesn't exactly repeat, but, it rhymes. And, like, for a historian in this era, right? The last decade, and really, let's go back. I can go back. Really, I pin it to Newt Gingrich and forward, like when that whole thing. But there became, as time went on, less and less of
Mm,
the give and take that is required um, to maintain a functioning, democracy, if you
yeah.
will. And
Yeah.
there's no to me, like, don't fear the past. Like, that's like you said, you said it best. Like, what are you fearing? I remember a discussion with my dad
Mm,
about this era, and I mentioned we when I was talking about either slavery or something because he grew up during segregation era, but
yeah.
he was like, I didn't do it. He wasn't being
Right.
defensive. I think he was a lawyer. It was a rhetorical point. Like, all right, Bob, hone your argument a little bit better. That it is not necessarily the individual's responsibility to make reparations for the entire institution of slavery or the entire institution of segregation, Southern
Yeah.
society. Um, but it is incumbent upon me, and this is what I learned from history, the humility to make right where I see some things that are historically wrong and accurate, something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
I try to do it with Long Live the ABB because my goal is conversation.
Yeah.
And I can bring anything back to Southern music history and culture and pretty much Allman Brothers because it all sort of flows through that. But in understanding the Allman Brothers, right, you can understand the South. You can understand the Southern mindset. You can understand its music history and culture. Um, and likewise, if you want to study ladies memorial
Yeah.
associations or
Yeah.
the USCT reunions or the things that free people did and black folk did to encourage their story, like, all of it matters. That's
Anything to get you out of yourself.
yeah. And I mean, I think that's what we're doing here, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's the issue. I wanna do one more before we go.
Yep.
You posted a wonderful piece from your wife who is German that says one of the issues with y'all is you have no shame. And I wanna start with this. 2 summers ago, 24, I spent time in Germany. I was in Freiburg for a couple of days and then spent some time in Berlin. Spent like a week in Berlin. The German people know how to reckon with the
Yeah.
past. And I was in Berlin. I was actually behind the wall. I had a map constantly, and I was like, where am I in relation to this wall? We stayed in the old East Berlin, but it's everywhere there. It's open, and they have the shame of shames with the
Yeah.
Holocaust and everything it
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that. Like, please, for the benefit of Americans and us, like, that was such a great point she made.
Yeah. No,
And by the way, I love it when non-Americans comment on American history. Some of my favorite students were international students over
yeah.
the years.
No.
So
I mean, first of all, I think it speaks to just how sheltered we are as a nation, in terms of how we see our own history. Right? We tend to study the United States history, apart from, not always, but apart from, the world stage. I think that's one of the things, just getting back to the Super Bowl, that Bad Bunny did really well, reminding us of how interconnected that last moment when he refers to God bless America, and then he rattles off all the names of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. Hell yeah, man. He just reminded us that we're all Americans, right? Okay,
I
so that
like that.
sort of makes the point here. We met in, of all places, Alabama, in 1998 at a school we both worked at. And so by then, I was just really beginning to get into the study of the Civil War. And I remember early on, taking her, especially when we moved to Virginia in 2000, and being so excited that I could now take my, I guess, fiance, soon to be wife, to places like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Richmond, right? And to see the monuments and to sort of describe all of this stuff. And I just remember, like, almost from the beginning, and I had never been to Germany at this point, and I just remember her sort of just, kind of like, "Oh, that's very nice." So you guys have monuments to people who were trying to establish an independent slaveholding republic. Do I have that right, kind of thing, right? Is this really what's going on here, right? And so, like, from the beginning, I was impressed with, or I had to deal with that very different perspective and very helpful perspective, that comes from, being in a relationship with someone not born here. But you're absolutely right, and especially going over to Germany for the first time, and I've been over a number of times. It is incredibly impressive, right? And the way in which towns and cities have, decided to mark that past and come to terms with that past. It's not always easy, and there are certainly issues today that Germany is dealing with. Um, but certainly their education system, even to this day, is still geared to dealing with very difficult history. And I think, there is certainly much to learn about that we have much to learn from that. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Susan Neiman, and I think the book is called "What the Germans Can Teach Us." Sort of looking for it on my shelf. I don't think I can spot it, but "What the Germans Can Teach Us." And she was actually, I think she was born in Mississippi, but teaches at a university in Berlin, and does a kind of comparative study of how Germany deals with the Holocaust and how, Americans have dealt with the Civil War and its legacy. And there's a lot of good stuff in there to sort of think about, right, in comparison. But absolutely, I think we would really do well as a nation to sort of not fear the outside to the extent that we do, right? There's so much of that, I think, that we're experiencing right now, both politically, but I think just more broadly in terms of how we see our past in relationship to the rest of the world. I mean, for historians like us, I mean, there are whole fields now, the quote unquote the Atlantic world, right? Civil War history now is very much kind of transatlantic in focus, right? Very recent developments, and that, whether that will sort of filter down into the public discourse, I don't know, but I think it's still safe to say that we're still very much um, sheltered and very narrow in our focus in terms of how we think about American history.
Yeah, and, we're I would imagine we're all myopic, like many cultures are very
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
myopic. We are
But
freaking
we're exceptional.
yes, I'm about to say we
Yeah,
are exceptionally so
we have a
for
reason.
for myriad reasons. Yes, like there's a whole bunch behind that. But your
Mhm.
point is really well taken. I think with all of us get a I wanna I'm pushing community, right? Because
Yeah,
that is the answer to that's the antidote to all of this. And the structures that we have had for community, I mean, Robert Putnam wrote an entire book about this 26 years ago that bowling alone that
uh,
called all of this hyper individualism, etc. What we find when we gather around a historical topic that interests us to talk about, to study, to read,
yeah,
if we're engaging in good faith and are like, I'm only gonna talk to people engaging in good faith. If you're gonna yell at me, I just I can't do it. I
life's
have
too
no
short.
time for you. I don't even have time to debate, um, devil's advocate rhetorical points, with people that I agree with. Like, no, I'm
Yeah,
really sorry. No, I mean, I'm not
right.
in the business of convincing you of anything. I'm just trying to if I'm convincing it is keep your eyes open, come to discussions with good faith, because memory is like history doesn't change. Memory is what changes and evolves over time. And that's essentially what we're dealing with. And then you get a bunch of nostalgia. Things were better in the past because they were the past and I was young. Like
Yeah.
we're always
Mhm.
I think in our lives, we're fighting against this
I agree.
stream.
Yeah,
And I'm just gathering in community people like you, people who are here, people who follow me. Like, I am unashamed, unabashed to talk about these things and to talk about them in deep ways to think about.
yeah. We need
And
it more
shit,
than ever. Yeah.
with Long Live the ABV, man, I'll tear apart. I just put this up. You'll love this. We were talking about primary sources. Oh, I'm very proud I get to bring this one up. In October 1970, the Macon newspaper released a press release that showed up in newspapers that said Duane Allman to play Jimi Hendrix's funeral. And I was like, what? Duane Allman, Jimi Hendrix's funeral, etc. So that's all there is. The road manager at the time, who's written a couple books, says didn't happen. Nobody ever acknowledged the source of the thing.
Hmm.
So I'm at a festival earlier this year, I think, last year. North Mississippi All-Stars are there. Now, their dad, Jim Dickinson, played with Duane Allman on several things. He was from Memphis. He's played on Wild Horses by the Stones. They are also carriers of the legacy intentionally, North Mississippi Blues, etc. He says, we're going to play this song that our dad recorded with Duane Allman and Eric Clapton called Mean Old World. And he said they recorded it because the entire Derek and the Dominoes band went to Jimi Hendrix's funeral. Eric Clapton was too distraught and would not go, so Duane stayed behind with him,
Uh,
and they recorded this song, Mean Old World,
huh.
during the Derek and the Dominoes sessions, the Layla sessions. Had I not been at that concert
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
known this story, known of this clip, so I put it up. Like in fact, the third piece was, I was actually interviewing a friend who had put that song on a Duane anthology in the 70s. So it was like had this complete full circle moment from a single thing in the newspaper that I knew wasn't right. You know, and
Yeah.
now you're like, oh, this is where it came from. Duane
Yeah.
did not go to the funeral, but he was going to go to the funeral.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for his management, that was a big fucking deal.
Yeah.
Big, big, big deal.
Yeah.
Primary sources, the littlest of ones, will enlighten and put pieces together. Um, I've so I was thinking about you when I was going through things. Like I just recently got some stuff for my own collection.
Uh,
They're canceled checks from the band, and so
wow.
I'm reading like the dates of when the checks are written and trying to figure out what's going on, at the time. One of them was a canceled check from like 2 days before a major drug bust that they got in Jackson, Alabama. Ooh, you want to talk about a scary story? They were busted in the wee hours of the morning in no horse town,
Wow.
Jackson, Alabama, with I called it in the book a pharmacopoeia. Like they had everything.
For that.
I went down and spoke there at a marker dedication, actually for the arrest, and the district attorney was there. Like the people, several of the attorneys who were involved, really old. But they're like, we weren't worried about drugs. We were worried about bootlegging. Like that was in 1971 in middle Alabama. The fact you're carrying around PCP and heroin and
Don't matter.
mushrooms was less important than if you were running moonshine. 1971. I mean, we just
Yeah.
ended segregation. JMO was in a separate jail. And according to the recollections of these guys, was a little freaked out by this. So they moved all the white guys into the black jail with him.
Huh.
We still have a black jail
Wow.
in 1971, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Primary sources.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
had
Absolutely. That's great.
I had a lot more to talk to you about searching for Black Confederates, Stone Mountain.
We'll do
You
this
want to keep
again.
going? Okay, let's do it again. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm with you there. I want to hype your book, the Black Confederates book. Let's make it real clear, Kevin. How many Black Confederates were there that were called soldiers, according to the Confederate records that we have?
It's difficult to know. I mean, the only thing that, look, we can point to in the final weeks of the war, the Confederate Congress in March, I think it's March 13th, 1865. Remember, the war ends really the next month, right?
Yep.
Between April and May of 65. So within the final few weeks, there are a couple, perhaps, maybe a regiment part of a regiment, couple companies in Richmond. We just don't know. And maybe a few other places the organization begins. In Richmond, we know that a small group of African Americans parade down Broad Street. They're never given weapons. They're housed in a jail cell, which gives you a sense of how the community views them. So there's an attempt in the final weeks of the war, and obviously, it doesn't pan out because the war ends before anything can happen as a result. But, look, it's a complicated subject. And here's another, getting full circle, some point we made earlier. Confederates are always clear during the war, at every point during the war, about the role of enslaved labor and free blacks in the army or in the overall Confederate war effort. They're very clear about this. And there's a reason why Confederates debated whether to enlist black men as soldiers in 1864 and early 1865. And the reason is because they understood just what a groundbreaking and transformative impact this would have on the very foundation, getting back to the cornerstone of the Confederacy and Alexander Stephens. They understood that it would transform the cornerstone of their government and the very purpose for which they're fighting for. And so, the short answer is the Confederate government doesn't enlist slaves at all. And I'm sorry, as slaves as soldiers until the very, very end of the war. And they're not able to make anything of it because slavery was the purpose for which they were fighting for. I'll leave it at
Yeah,
that.
Kevin doesn't say it, but there's near zero.
Near zero.
I mean,
It's insignificant.
that's a good way to put it. It is an
Yeah.
insignificant number. It is a made up construct
No.
to, you know,
And it obscures all the things the Confederate government did between 1861 and 65 to protect slavery. That's the point.
yeah,
That's what we should be focusing on.
yeah.
That's what truly matters.
The book, I'm going to say, y'all, I should have grabbed it. The only one I grabbed was Interpreting the Civil War
Because of
because
you.
Kevin
More
and I this
collaboration. More
when
collaboration.
Kevin wrote this book when I was editor of a book series, but searching for Black Confederates. So all of this behind me was a bookshelf that fell off the wall.
That's right.
And so, like, I'm
No,
staring at an abyss down here. This is all pretty. Kevin, man, I am so thankful. It's like 10% of my readers come directly from you. So
I'm
stay on Substack, please. but
not going
but we
anywhere.
have a lot in common. And I
Yeah.
just want to say, for those who are my readers who are here, Civil War Memory, Kevin's it really writes a lot about the present day, what is going on and how it relates to the present day. It means a lot to me to have had you as a fellow traveler. You've been a
Same
great
here, Bob.
sounding board, just a tremendous thinker. And we're going to do this again. This
Anytime.
was this was tremendous time. Thank you all for joining us. We've had a hell
Yeah.
of a crowd today,
It's
and
great.
a lot of times you see that crowd dropping off as you go live. So this is surprising. My first Substack live, Kevin. Thanks
They
for
love you,
holding my
Bob.
hand through all this, and appreciate you, man. We'll catch up online.
Talk to you soon, Bob. You take
All right,
care.
thanks, man. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Bye bye.